Good morning, or good afternoon, or good evening, depending on whenever you may be listening to this. As promised, I wanted to kind of do a bit of a video in order to kind of go over some of the things that to finish up our study on the book of Judges. I am definitely going to warn you that this is kind of some subject matter that really we could probably spend months on just kind of the two chapters of or three chapters of like Judges 19 through 21. But I'm going to try to do a little bit of service here. Actually, I'm going to pick up where we left off before and get into starting with Judges 17. But before I do, I want to go to my home devotional, which, as I said, is Hope by Billy Graham. The reading for today, November 24th, is titled The Right Attitude. And the scripture reading comes from 1 Chronicles 29, verse 13, and it's the NIV translation. And it says, "Now, our God, we give you thanks and praise your glorious name." And the devotion reads that the Pilgrim Fathers who landed at Plymouth to settle in what became the United States of America can teach us an important lesson about giving thanks. During that first long winter, 7 times as many graves were made for the dead as homes were made for the living. Seed imported from England failed to grow, and a ship that was to bring food and relief brought instead 35 more mouths to feed, but no provisions. Some pilgrims caught fish, and others hunted wildfowl and deer. They had little English flour and some Indian corn. Yet William Brewster, rising from the scanty dinner of clams and water, gave thanks to God for the abundance of the sea and the treasure hid in the sand. According to today's standards, the pilgrims had almost nothing, but they possessed profound and heartfelt gratitude for God, for his love and mercy. Gratitude is one of the greatest Christian virtues. Ingratitude, one of our most vicious sins. Our English words thanks and think come from the same words. If we'll stop to think, maybe we'll be more thankful. Amen. Definitely, I really appreciate that thought from this, particularly as tomorrow is Thanksgiving. And you know what? I do want to open with a prayer. So would you pray with me? Dear God in heaven and here on earth, you truly are our rock and the foundations upon which not just our faith is built, but our lives are built. We offer you up this day and every day, but particularly as we enter into this season of Thanksgiving, all of those things that we are thankful for. We are thankful for so many things, from all of the small things, from the breath in our lungs, from the sunshine that brings life to this earth, and for all of those times that you are there in trials and in struggles, that you turn our challenges into successes, but also that you continue to guide us and teach us that we may ever grow into the image that you have created us to be and in the wills in our lives. We offer you thanks this day. Particularly, we also offer you up our joys, but also our concerns. We know that there are those who are ill, who are grieving, who we know that we've heard about of late that are maybe in their last days. And we ask you to grant them peace, peace and the understanding that they are yours and that they return to you. We also ask for your peace and for your mercy, and just, that we would all be there in these difficult times as friends and family in order to elevate and be the people that you call us to be and elevate the church. God, at this time we pray the prayer that your Son taught us, saying together, Our Father who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done, on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our trespasses as we forgive those who trespass against us. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. For thine is the kingdom, and the power, and the glory, forever and ever. Amen. Well, diving into Judges, I think particularly some of those areas in uh, our Father prayer, the one that we say pretty regularly, may come into lead us not into temptation, and also the deliverance from evil. Particularly as we kind of look at some of these difficult passages. Um, so I've entitled this part of the study to Heck in a Handbasket. As you may have noticed, if the titles of the topics that I've kind of been choosing have been getting steadily a little bit, well, they've been growing in their intensity. Um, I will actually miss, I think, especially in this Bible study, as I will miss the interaction, the questions, and things along those lines. I encourage you to email me. We will have, I've already spoken with Pastor Ron for next week. We will have a meeting next week. I believe it's, well, let me get my calendar up. It's December 2nd is our next meeting. We will have about 30 minutes at the beginning of that to kind of transition from the end of Judges and into the Advent Bible study. Uh, I appreciate that Judges is probably not so great for an Advent study. But I encourage you to pose your questions, to maybe email them, or like I said, we'll have that 30 minutes kind of at the beginning to kind of review some of the things that I'm sure I am not going to cover everything in my outline, and I'm also not going to try to belabor it by reading everything to you, but try to maybe highlight on a few things. So I've sent my outline out to you, and I think this is kind of more of like a guided reading to some extent. Some of the things I think in review, the themes of Judges as well as kind of some of the background study. And first off, starting with the question of, well, what is a judge? Some of the things we've already discussed in this Bible study, but kind of keeping a few things out in front of us is that they serve generally as like a covenant mediator and bringer of justice is kind of literally, I think, one interpretation of actually like the word that's used for judges. Also, they serve in some ways as like a mythical hero. They can be all of the above. In some cases, they're none of the above. Uh, but so that's kind of a general understanding, I guess, of the judges. Additionally, I want to kind of go back to the cycle of Judges or the discussion or conversation about that. That starts with um, Judges in chapter 2, verse 11 is kind of where it really defines like the general outline of the story or the cycle of Judges. And some things get added, some things get taken away. And it's definitely like a deterioration of this cycle as we go through it. I've listed a few things there that kind of definitely decrease as we go through this story of the Judges. Deference to God, deliverance, morality, unity. As we'll see, definitely when we get into chapters 20 and 21, it really seems that there isn't really any unity between the Israelites except when they determine to go out and fight one of their own, which is the Benjamites. Is kind of, especially starting in chapter 20, is when they all come together to do that. But anyway, we'll get to it when we get there. Also, the decreasing status and the influence of women. When you look at the beginning of Judges, you've got Axa, who comes in riding a donkey, is very assertive, speaks up for herself. There is definitely, I think, good evidence, more or less, that the society at the beginning of Judges was more egalitarian, more fairly power was more fairly distributed. It was a hard and difficult time, no doubt, but there were fewer voices being silenced. That I think we do see more of that happens as the story of Judges progresses. Also, a new thing that I wanted to add in there is that the Hebrew word harem, sometimes with a thrown at the beginning of it, means a ban or also devoted to destruction. We see that more often in Joshua and a little bit earlier in some of the Old Testament, but this comes up a little bit, particularly I think, as we get into these final chapters of Judges. And I also want to continue to keep this question out in front of us of just asking who is the narrator of the story. There are definitely some occasions where, it's not just a straight this happened and this happened and this happened, but there is a bit of kind of commentary and interpretation that's entered in there. I think Jim Hewitt and I have talked about a bit about, if this was written during the time of the exile, or if this is like a post-mortem look back on, kind of what the heck happened. But there's definitely some interesting statements that occur, I think, both in Judges and in Joshua, as well as elsewhere in the Bible. In the Old Testament in particular, where, well, actually, the question that I pose here is, are some of the divine attributions that the narrator or the commentator makes, are those truly indicative of the person and the nature of God, or are they interpretations, good or bad, that are kind of their own personal kind of commentary? I don't know, but I do think it's kind of an interesting question to pose, especially in understanding the Bible reading a bit more in depth. Also, I threw this in here as one of the things that this next bullet point I threw in as I've used the example before, is that oftentimes when we're reading the Bible, particularly in the Old Testament, the story is told pretty much kind of like my brother tells stories. My brother Sean, he's 7.5 years older than me, as I'm sure you know. We have a bit of a contentious but good relationship. And one of the things that definitely, especially growing up, that we definitely kind of pointed out to my brother is that he would get so excited about telling a story about a movie or something that happened at school or something else like that. He'd get so excited that he'd start in the middle, he'd jump around, maybe get to the end, go back to like the middle beginning, maybe get something else in there, and then start up from the beginning a little bit again, and then jump again to like the middle end, and jump all around, and more or less kind of by the end of the story, you were really confused about what actually happened, but you got some of the highlights or the high points. That doesn't directly translate necessarily with the Bible, but particularly when we're looking at some of these stories in the Old Testament, remember that like the chapter headings and things that are in our modern Bibles, those didn't exist, period. And although there are definitely some occasions where these writings were separated or were written separately and then kind of later combined, for the most part, the oldest Bibles and the oldest Hebrew texts that we have don't have these chapter delineations. In some ways, don't even necessarily even have the title delineations. And so when you get into particularly like the Hebrew, a lot of times the stories are told in humongous, I mean, like chapter, book, run-on sentences. And what's kind of interesting about that thought or that concept is, there's not always a great delineation. And so it kind of leads to some of these theories, like you know, Judges and Joshua may actually be the same story. That may also lead directly into First Samuel, and some of these other kinds of things. So the greater context of kind of understanding when it comes to kind of understanding where does this story fit into the greater story, the greater picture that's already in progress, is definitely kind of interesting to dive into. All right. So diving into Micah, the Levite, and the Danites, we're in chapter 17 and 18. So some things, like I've said, kind of going all along, is names mean a whole lot, particularly in the Old Testament, and it comes up quite a bit in the book of Judges. So the name Micah, particularly in Hebrew, means who is like God, and more directly means who's like Yahweh, who's like, the God of Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, everything else. And also, when you really dive into this chapter of 17 and 18, there's a whole lot of stuff that's really going on here. This is like a field day for people who like to write, 40 pages on one word or one sentence in the Bible. But kind of some snapshots or some highlights is there's definitely this indication of, well, starting at the beginning, not telling the story like my brother does. There's a definite symbolism with the story that occurs immediately before it, which is the story of Samson and Delilah. Samson and Delilah betrays Samson for 1,100 pieces of silver. And that's the same amount that in the beginning of the story of Micah with his mother, that's the same amount of silver that went missing that Micah stole from his mother. That may be coincidence, but it does kind of maybe open up the possibility that, hey, since these chapter delineations and everything else like that aren't hard and aren't fine, and it's very possible that the story of Samson never necessarily, we put a period on the end of it, and just leads right into this one. It might be, well, from the perspective of people hearing it or reading it, that were Hebrew folks in the exile, there might have been kind of this direct correlation that maybe the mother of Micah was Delilah. That is completely a theory. I don't know. The Bible, the text itself is ambiguous to some extent, to that. But so it does open up that idea of theory. So a couple of other things here is a teraphim is a household god or an idol. And what's interesting definitely in chapter 17, verse 6, is we get this interjection kind of in the middle of the story. Actually looking at 17, verse 6. Yeah. So this man Micah had a shrine, starting with verse 5, had a shrine, and he made an ephod and a teraphim. So he's got a shrine, he's got an ephod, and he's got a teraphim. Now the whole ephod thing hasn't worked out that well for Gideon and Abimelech. But this definitely seems to be like, household idol making and effectively kind of establishing your own religion to a great extent. But after all of this, it says, the man Micah had come to the shrine, ephod and teraphim, and installed one of his sons who became his priest. And then we go right from there into verse 6, commentary. In those days, there was no king in Israel. And this is really the first occurrence in the book of Judges where that phrase in and of itself is specifically attached to, and all the people did what was right in their own eyes. That's a recurring theme throughout the whole book of Judges. And then we pick back up into the story. Now there was a young man of Bethlehem in Judah, in the clan of Judah. And this is definitely kind of interesting to me, is because, yes, the Levites are a tribe that didn't have land possession. But it says here that this man was a Levite, but also from the clan of Judah, where Judah did have land possession. And so this definitely kind of, I don't know, it maybe brings up the question of, well, was this guy a Judahite? Was he a Levite? Can he be both? Because as a Levite, they would be living effectively in like the towns and the other areas, surrounding. And then also this question about the Levite is, why the heck was he unemployed effectively, or he was moving around in order to find work? Particularly going back earlier in the Old Testament, there were provisions that were supposed to be made for the Levites. Their inheritance was to be the priestly tribe, and they were cared for by the other tribes as part of this, greater tribal community and family. So it's interesting to maybe dive into, especially the ways that why it's written this way, kind of asking those types of questions. Kind of continuing forward with the fact that this Levite is also effectively just a priest for hire, as will play out in the rest of the story. And then when Micah hires this priest to be the priest of his shrine, of his house, of his ephod and his teraphim, well, first off, the Levites are supposed to be priests for God. And, this basically in 1713, this kind of legitimizes, I think, at least to Micah, hey, I've got a priest for God, a priest from God, that, now is my priest over my, effectively my own household religion. And it definitely is interesting because the words used here in 13 is, then Micah said, now I know that the Lord, that is Yahweh, that not just God, little g, but the God will prosper me, because the Levite has become my priest. So there's definitely a bit of a breaking down that's going on here, as who's worshiping God is I think kind of a bit of a good question here. Not only that, but Micah's mother, even when she gets the silver back, the grammar there even indicates that she potentially was, this is going back to chapter 17, verse 3. After Micah stole this, and his mother says, actually picking up in verse 2, kind of the last part of it, and his mother said, may my son be blessed by the Lord, Yahweh, God, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, the God of Jacob. Then he returned the 1,100 pieces of silver to his mother, and his mother said, I consecrate the silver to the Lord, to God, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, that God, from my hand for my son to make an idol of cast metal. So, yeah, there's definitely a lot of bad stuff going on here, especially the violation of honoring God above all others. All right. So, so getting on into the Danites. What's kind of ironic, especially as the way this story plays out, is the name Dan literally means justice, which seems great, especially in this context of the judges. Judges are supposed to be bringers of justice. So, especially if you're hearing this as a story being told, and hey, here we go, in these days there was no king in Israel, and in those days the tribe of the Danites, yay, the Danites should be bringers of justice because God values justice. But then you see there's a big problem that develops here. That's in 18 verse 1, kind of the first part of it. And in those days, the tribe of the Danites, the bringers of justice, was seeking for itself a territory to live in. For until then, no territory among the tribes of Israel has been allotted to them. And that definitely brings up a big problem, is if you look in Joshua 19 verses 40 through 48, the tribe of Dan did receive an allotment of land. And then it kind of juxtaposes against and it explains a little bit further forward. And this is, I think, maybe the narrator or the commentator coming in the story of Joshua saying, yeah, but this happened, this happened, this happened. And it sets it up as maybe this is a bit of a parallel kind of story, at least if you, well, let's look at Joshua 19, 40 through 48. I'm going to go to Bible Gateway. All right. So Joshua 19, 40 through 48. The seventh lot came out for the tribe of Dan according to its clans. The territory of their inheritance included all of these different places. If you're reading them aloud, just throw a in there somewhere and try to make the consonants sound right. When the territory of the Danites, and this is kind of in parentheses, at least in the translation I'm reading, this is the NIV, I think, that I've got up now, says, when the territory of the Danites was lost to them, they went up and attacked Leshem, put it to the sword, and occupied it. They settled in Leshem and named it Dan after their ancestor. Now, what's kind of an interesting thought or idea here is if this is a parallel kind of account of what's going on here in, or at least like the foreshadow that's happening here in the book of Judges, they get the names wrong, or maybe. And maybe there is something interesting in the difference in the names. So the name that shows up in the book of Joshua is that this place that they conquered was Leshem, which means a precious stone. Whereas in the book of Judges here, the place that they go out and then conquer is called Laish, which means a lion. And this is definitely interesting, particularly if you do subscribe to this idea that maybe the book of Judges is kind of a satire, a bit, that the people of Laish are described in here as at least twice in verse 7 of chapter 18 in Judges. They're described at least twice as being quiet and unsuspecting people. So these quiet and unsuspecting people live in a town named after a lion. And that definitely kind of seems a little bit humorous, absurd, maybe is probably the better word. But this also, definitely the way it's told in the book of Judges, kind of brings on this question of, I mean, the Danites, where is God in this? And they're going out and basically conquering a quiet and unsuspecting people. And this violence that's committed on them. Basically that ties in with this idea of harem, or the ban, devote to destruction. Now, granted, they then occupy this city, and then they call it Dan, which means justice. There's a whole lot of irony there, that Dan, the justice bringers, would conquer a quiet and unsuspecting people, take their city, and then name it Dan, or justice. And then they go back and they plunder Micah's house, and steal his idols and his shrines and everything else, and in fact steal his priest, which continues to be for hire. Arguably, maybe he kind of thought he didn't have any other recourse, like, his life might have been in danger, but still, this is a Levite who is not being cared for in the way that was mapped out by God for the Israelite society, and therefore is basically a priest of a household idol that then goes and follows the Danites. in committing this violence. Uh, So that's the Danites. Now, jumping straight into chaos, crisis, and civil war, and this is 19 through 21, which um, is difficult to read, I will admit. A couple of things for context and interpretation here to keep in mind. Um, Saul, when you look forward in 1 Samuel 9:21 and 1 Samuel 10:26, Saul, the first king of Israel, after Israel says, "Hey, we want a king," is a Benjamite from Gibeah. And this story that occurs in Judges, which is right before First Samuel, is very not complimentary of the Benjamites or the Gibeahites, or Gibeah, for that matter. Um, there is kind of a prevailing theory out there that that at least the Book of Judges, or this instance in the Book of Judges, is kind of building up the monarchy, or at least David in the monarchy. But when you put that into a bigger perspective, there's a big problem with that, in that the monarchy was just as sinful in many ways uh, as as the judges, as this period of the judges, and particularly from that understanding, uh, David and Bathsheba is a big blow to that concept, or that idea that this is propaganda in support of David and the monarchy, when definitely nobody comes out smelling like roses either. So jumping forward with the Levite and his wife or concubine, I keep kind of putting that slash in there, wife, concubine. It depends on which translation you read. The grammar in the Hebrew Bible is unclear and uncertain. I think it's presumed that the this unnamed woman is a concubine, because as a priest, I guess he wasn't supposed to be married, maybe. But we've already kind of established that the Levites kind of really weren't doing much in the way of um, worship of Yahweh, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, at this point in time. So we'll see. Um, Also, the proximity of the two stories, these could definitely be two different Levites. It could be the same Levite. We honestly don't know. With the story of the Levite who went with the Danites after serving as Micah's priest, or maybe this is like earlier in his life, later in his life. Maybe it's two completely separate people. We're not entirely sure. So definitely getting into this a little bit, and I recognize that this is very much hard passages to read, particularly because of kind of the graphicness of some of the violence. There is also a whole lot going on here too. In particular, this kind of, well, there seems to be just this entire breakdown of society, and particularly where that shows up is in chapter 19, verses 11 through 14, where, in particular, Gibeah was supposed to be safe. 19, 11 through 14. So in chapter 19:11, it reads that when they were near Jabus, the day was far spent, and the servant said to the master, "Come now, let us turn aside to the city of the Jebusites." Incidentally, this is Jerusalem just before it became Jerusalem, and spend the night in it. But his master said to him, "We will not turn aside into a city of foreigners who do not belong to the people of Israel, but we will continue on to Gibeah." Then he said to his servant, "Come, let us try to reach one of these places and spend the night at Gibeah or Ramah." So Gibeah was supposed to be safe. It definitely was supposed to be safer um, than Jabus, um, Jerusalem, kind of not quite Jerusalem yet. So they go to Gibeah, and the definite thing that you kind of find out there is the Israelite laws of hospitality and everything else like that seem to have completely broken down too, because they go there and nobody takes them in. Um, Looking at verse 16, then at the evening there was, oh, hold on, no, actually a little bit earlier than that, maybe back in 15. He went and sat down in the open square of the city, but no one took them in to spend the night. This story definitely is pretty synonymous or parallels the story of Lot and Sodom and Gomorrah. Lot and Sodom, excuse me. But one of the big problems here is this isn't an Israelite living in a foreign land and being kind of like the sole and lone good guy. Um, this is an Israelite town. This is Gibeah of Benjamin, that specifically was chosen because it's Israelite, because these are friends, neighbors, cousins. These are people who are devoted to and committed to caring for one another, and nobody does. And in fact, it ends up being pretty horrible. Um, so, a couple of other good points, kind of to maybe look at in this story, is there's this statement, particularly in 1924, when the old man of the town of Gibeah is kind of negotiating with the people who came there to rape the Levite, and he's negotiating with them, saying, "Here are my virgin daughter and his concubine, the Levite's concubine. Let me bring them out." The translation I have says, "Ravish them and do whatever you want to them, but against this man do not do such a vile thing." This is very problematic and difficult, no matter how you try to justify it. So I don't think I will. I do think it's pretty horrible. You can try to say stuff about laws of hospitality and all of these other kinds of things, but no, this is evil. And what kind of makes it worse is this is Israelite upon Israelite evil. Not to mention the place and the status that this old man's daughter and the Levite, the unnamed concubine or wife, have in this story, which is none. They are property at this point, which is very much a far cry, and unvaluable property, apparently, which is a far cry from where we were at the beginning of Judges. Um, Also, some other kinds of things that really, um, well, especially kind of digging into this a bit. Um, it is generally assumed that the Levite's wife or concubine was dead in the morning, but the text of the Bible is very ambiguous about that. If you look at chapter 19, verses 27 through 28, it reads that after the men had abused uh, the Levite's wife, in the morning her master got up, opened the doors of the house, and when he went out to go on his way, there was his concubine laying at the door of the house, with her hands on the threshold. "Get up," he said to her, "we are going." But there was no answer. Then he put her on the donkey, and the man set out for his home. Um, this could be coincidence or anything else, but because I do see definite symmetry and symbolism in the Bible, Axa, the first woman mentioned in Judges, comes in riding on a donkey. I think I even made a joke there that my friend C.P. Watkins, who loves reading the King James Version because he can say ass, loved to say she got down off of her ass. The parallel, or the kind of bookend to that now, is this concubine who is dead maybe, or dead soon, is now placed on a donkey and kind of goes out of town in that way. And the horror of what the Levite does afterwards definitely doesn't help. But this thought or this idea, potentially, especially that the grammar here doesn't really tell us whether whether or not she was dead at this point in the morning, maybe makes that a little bit more horrible. The fact that the Levite dismembered her and then sent her out, sent the pieces out to the 12 tribes. Also, I want to note that skipping forward a bit in chapter 20, verses 4 through 7, when the Levite is talking to the Benjamites, he very conveniently leaves out his own culpability. And although he does indicate that she died, he doesn't say how, where, why. It's kind of just assumed, maybe, that she died because of this incident. No doubt she very well may have. But that the fact that that ambiguity is still there kind of, really makes this all the more horrifying, I believe. What's kind of interesting, too, also kind of fast-forwarding into verses 20 and 21 and everything else, is that the response here from the Benjamites is to commit further atrocity. That definitely does not fit with kind of this lex talionis, the eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth that comes from Exodus 21:24, which is inherently limiting of the right of retribution. That you don't perpetrate and escalate violence. Rather, it is, I think, intended in the way that it's read in Exodus 21:24 as a seeking of justice, a balancing of the scales, as you were. But so basically, anyway, it puts limits on this right of retribution, which is definitely not followed. And I think, especially for anyone, Hebrew or otherwise, who's reading this, we can very safely say that what happens afterwards is not justice. That also makes it a little problematic when you read some of the things that occur here. For instance, getting into Judges chapter 1, the Israelites came out from Dan and Beersheba, including the land of Gilead, and the congregation assembled in one body before the Lord at Mizpah. Now, I did put in there that Mizpah is Hebrew word for watchtower. More specifically, it's not like a watchtower that we generally think of, although it can be that. But what it really reminds us, or is reminiscent of, is if you go back to Genesis chapter 31, verses 43 through 55, this is the covenant that Jacob and Laban make when they kind of meet each other for the first time after a while. And they erect this tower of this heap of stones, effectively. And that signifies this covenant that they make with each other. So this idea of a watchtower is that kind of a tower where God is watching, where something important happened that that signifies God's presence. So, especially when it says here that in one body, they assembled in one body before the Lord at Mizpah, I mean, that's kind of almost a repetition, that they gathered together before God at the place where God is watching, this heap of stones. It is a little bit problematic, though, that what they're doing here is, effectively maybe not really following God. And I think maybe is probably not strong enough. there's not a whole lot of mentions of God or the God of Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, the Lord, whatever, kind of in here. And it gets a little problematic, I think, particularly when we do read some of those occasions, which I also maintain is a bit of commentary. For instance, if you look at chapter 20, skipping ahead to verse 23, the Israelites went up and wept before the Lord God, Yahweh, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, until the evening, and they inquired of the Lord, shall we again draw near to battle against our kinsfolk? Another problem kind of in here, or at least a bookend or a parallel, is when they inquire of the Lord, the Israelites came together, Jabus, about going up. Going against it by a lot. People said going up. So the Lord, Gibeah, no, you know what? Let me just look it up real quick. When they inquired of the Lord, hold on. I've got it in my commentary here. This earth claims in 18:23 and 27. So they go up before the Lord. So let's look at 2018. Oh yeah, here we go. So chapter 20, verse 18. The Israelites proceeded to go up to Bethel, where they inquired of God, which of us shall go up first to battle against the Benjamites? First off, did they ask God whether they should go up to battle against the Benjamites? But what's interesting about this is this definitely parallels or kind of bookends the beginning when they inquire of God who should go out and fight the Canaanites. But now they're fighting each other. They're fighting other Israelites. And the response is the same, that Judah should go up first. This gets into another issue, is that it says, and the Lord answered, Judah shall go up first. And so this is problematic. That gets into, does God condone this violence, or does God justify this violence? To that, I kind of want to maybe weasel my way out of it a little bit. One of the things is I do want to kind of get into how they inquired of the Lord. We talked a little bit about the Urim and the Thummim. Is this some sort of divination, which would make sense with the fact that later on, even in this chapter, they cast lots. But how is God responding is not clear. And in some ways, I do want to ask the question of, did the people of Israel perceive that that's what God said? Was it actually what God said? And or is this kind of a narrative or an editorial commentary? Which goes back to my question of kind of who's the narrator. I got to tell you, I want to fall on the side of this being, some narrative commentary, or that this is kind of maybe some other kind of perception of God's will, and that it was not in fact God's will. That definitely fits with my own image of God. But the Bible's ambiguous on that, and I think that maintaining that ambiguity, maintaining that tension actually is important. So I also want to leave open the possibility that maybe God does sanction this and wrestle with that. All right. So coming up between Jacob and Laban. So there's a lot more that's going on here, but effectively this just spirals and spirals and spirals all the way down to a complete and utter civil war. The harem, that ban or devoting to destruction, all of that you may read about in Joshua or even in Deuteronomy or anything else. the opening of Judges indicates that these, the Canaanites and all of these other inhabitants of the land remained, so weren't entirely devoted to destruction. Um, but it seems like the most significant devotion to destruction was of their own, of the Benjamites. Enough so that the Israelites continued to perpetrate additional violence and kidnapped and very likely raped at least 400 to 600 Benjamite women so that the tribe would not die out. Yeah, that's not okay. And that's definitely not justice. Particularly in a book of the Bible that's devoted to bringers of justice. Um, so there's a lot more to dig in there, I'm sure, but the last line of Judges is, we've been hearing as a repetition for quite a bit. In those days, there was no king in Israel. All the people did what was right in their own eyes. This could be like an editorial comment or propaganda for the Davidic monarchy, the kings. I genuinely like the interpretation that it very likely is not. I'm definitely intrigued by this idea of it being a satire, perhaps even as a reflection during one of the later kings, or even during the Babylonian exile, and that this is more or less just kind of a recognition that there were no kings at that time. You may remember all of these kings and all of the evil things that those kings did, but here is a time when we didn't have kings, and we still did a whole heck of a lot of evil. I think that's a perspective of maybe like that backwards autopsy of what the heck went wrong. So some 32,000-foot questions. Some things that do come up, I think, in Judges, maybe not as definitively as they do elsewhere in the Old Testament, but one of the questions of, does God change God's mind? There are instances definitely where God is moved to pity or compassion, or actually, the one that stands out in my mind is the story of Jonah and the whale, which the big fish, which I've referred to, because Nineveh was devoted to destruction by God, and then God was moved to pity and compassion and did not destroy them. Now, was that God changing God's mind? Something else like that. But that, I think, also gets into maybe a bit of a personal theological question that I wrestle with a good bit is, does God grow with us as humanity, as a whole? And that is maybe a bit of a personal theory exploration. I don't necessarily know, but I find it definitely thought-provoking, particularly as the movement of the relationship between God and humanity through the Bible. That is, I think, thought-provoking. Some other things that I brought up, especially last time that I was reading ahead on this, is like the John Wesley quote, that man is very far gone from original righteousness, and of his own nature inclined to evil, and that continuously. John Wesley. I like that it's kind of further, prefaced in grace and prevenient grace, and it's only through God's grace that we're capable of good. But there definitely, I think, that shows up pretty pronounced in the book of Judges. Is this tendency, this human tendency towards violence, self-assertion, chaos, evil, especially from my own reflections, modern understandings, is that kind of the foundation for humanity, for humankind? and being able to kind of ask and wrestle with that question, I think is, well, for me, I think it helps build faith. Critical thinking question I want to throw in here is the story are these stories, so Judges, are these divinely inspired? Is the narrator divinely inspired? Are people's interpretations or the attributions that they make towards God, or the events or the ways that God influences, is that divinely inspired? These are all, I think, greater questions in the nature of how we read, perceive, and understand the Bible. Especially in my being able to articulate, as I do believe that the Bible as a whole is divinely inspired. I believe that every word written on these pages has significance and meaning in life and humanity. And I believe that is divinely inspired. Does that necessarily mean and equate to, the perception that each and every word is a word from God through humankind and is unfailable? That is definitely a bigger question to dive into. And I think that would be an interesting exercise to do. I think I already kind of mentioned this a little bit before. Is Judges history, myth, parable, something in between, or all of the above? That's an ongoing discussion, of course. Does God sanction or even encourage mass violence in the Old Testament? How does that fit or not fit with our understanding of God? Personal reflection, do we seek confirmation from God with our own wills and desires, or do we inquire of God? That is, that is a personal reflection. My hope is that every time I open the Bible, I am opening it in order to be changed, in order to be grown and influenced. From experience, I also know that I can open the Bible and I can have my own beliefs affirmed. And I think that's also maybe something to prayerfully keep in mind as we move forward in reading the Bible. I think there's I wanted to throw in a quote here from St. Augustine. This comes from his writing of the City of God. His translation, absolutely, but and it's an interesting reflection, I think, is that God is always trying to give good things to us, but our hands are literally too full. Literally is my own kind of emphasis. Our hands are too full to receive them. That's just definitely kind of thought-provoking to me, especially when we get into some of these types of thoughts or conversations about trials and difficulties, and how I recognize in my own life how when those are absent, that there's complacency, maybe even this belief that I deserve. Another interesting kind of side note, at least in the conclusion of the commentary, that I wanted to throw in there is especially reading through Judges, there's a lot of social stuff going on here, and I think it definitely kind of causes us to look a bit more closely at at society throughout history, but also our current society. One of the things that particularly the author of this commentary brings up is that, especially in Western countries, very much in the U.S., we very, very, very much value autonomy. I very, very much value autonomy, the ability to do things on my own. But very literally, the author of the commentary holds up that autonomy literally means self-law or self-rule. And in the perspective of kind of this deference or this deference to God, kind of against the self assertion, my own self assertion, against perhaps God's will. This idea of autonomy, I think, kind of, or this overvaluation of autonomy, in some ways may not always be a virtue. And that's something that I will continue to wrestle with moving forward. Anyway, I think I'm going to go ahead and wrap up there. I hope I didn't bore you or read too much. I hope you do dive a bit further, not just into Judges. I know, especially this last part is a bit difficult. Um, there are a whole lot of great commentaries. I do recommend this one, as well as this is a bit more, I guess, like diving into the root words and kind of heady and things along those lines. Some of the other ones that I mentioned is Conversations with Scripture. That was the one that I couldn't necessarily get from Amazon, but also this Crash Test Dummies, Surprising Lessons from the Book of Judges. That does interest me, and I may have to take a look at that here in a little bit. I encourage you to continue exploring and continue with your questions. I also want to say that I hope each and every one of you has a great Thanksgiving. There truly is so much to be thankful for. I was actually reflecting just the other day that this time last year, we did not have Thanksgiving dinner with family. Instead, my wife's side of the family decided we were going to make kind of our signature dish, but make like two or three or four of them and drop them off at each other's houses so that Thanksgiving individually would still have like Aunt Bubba's famous, green bean casserole or, the coleslaw or anything else. That was an interesting thing to do. I think it was memorable and everything else. But I look forward this year to sharing Thanksgiving with friends and family and giving thanks to God for all of the things that we have in our lives. And maybe even taking a cue from St. Augustine, being able to let go of some of the blessings that I'm holding on to, and be thankful for them, but also being willing to receive new ones in the year forward. I thank you for sticking with the reading through Judges, and I hope that your love for the Old Testament in particular, but for your Bible as a whole, continues to grow and develop. Thank you. Go in peace.